Welcome, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an over 100-year-old faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we're so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR. We acknowledge that this land and the many lands that you are joining us from, its history and all the being seen and unseen, known and unknown, and as we step into our work on the many lands that we are joining this call from, most of us as uninvited guests. We offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this place and all of these places. And we invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. And as you have questions, you don't have to hold on to them for later. You can type them in the chat box anytime you would like. When we get started, you can direct those questions to me. I'll be listed as Methodist Federation for Social Action. We do have closed captioning available. It's automatically generated, so do expect spelling errors and such like that, but that is available. And again, we're glad you are joining us. I'm going to turn this conversation over to our moderator for our conversation today, Lisa Bender, the chair of UMKR.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today. United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR, is an international justice movement of United Methodist laity and clergy responding to the Kairos Palestine document and the ongoing work of Kairos Palestine and Global Kairos for Justice. We educate and mobilize advocacy for Palestinian rights within our denomination and beyond, striving for the goal of freedom, justice, and equality for all the people in the Holy Land. There is so much to cover today that we will need 75 minutes for the presentations, and then we'll have a 15-minute time for question and answers. So we especially want to welcome those of you who are General Conference delegates, and we encourage you to reach out to us, especially if you are willing to help us in your legislative committee and in the plenary about these resolutions. And those who are not delegates, we invite you to reach out to those who are your delegates. We're also available to speak to your delegation if you would like a presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Teresa Basile, UMKR's Director of Communications and Chair of our Education Committee. She will share the need to renew two critical foundational resolutions about our stand on Palestine, Israel that were submitted by the General Board of Church and Society. These have been adopted and readopted over the years at General Conference, and they state the foundational positions of the United Methodist Church. And if you have questions at any time, as we said, to post them in the chat. So Teresa.
Hello. Thanks, Lisa. I am going to immediately start screen sharing. And, all right, can you all see that well? Since I can't see you, I will assume if I don't hear anything that it's all right. All right, well, as many of you know, the United Methodist Church has taken a stand for Palestinian human rights at our General Conference for several decades. But our church resolutions only last for 8 years, and there are 3 excellent resolutions related to Israel-Palestine. that are due to expire this year. So I'm going to cover two of those here now. The most important of these, probably the most important statement that our church has ever made on Israel-Palestine, is opposition to Israeli settlements in Palestinian land. As you can see, it was adopted first in 2004, all the way through to 2016, and that was with improvements each time. This is the church resolution that justice advocates most often quote and refer people to. It conveys our church's longstanding and strong position opposing not only the illegal Israeli settlements, but everything that goes with them, with the settlements enterprise, all aspects of Israel's military occupation of the Palestinian territory. So to understand the importance of this resolution, we need to understand what the Israeli occupation is and the enormous suffering that it has caused for over 50 years. One major aspect of this occupation is the destruction of homes and communities. I'm going to be giving you a lot of images in this part of the presentation to give you some idea, some feeling for what the pain of the occupation is. Israel's illegal occupation of occupied Palestinian territory has included massive numbers of home demolitions. Hundreds of thousands have lost their homes due to this brutal ethnic cleansing. I can't really show you with a few photographs the suffering of thousands of families who have lost everything they had due to this inhuman and violent practice. And it is not just homes, businesses, farmland, clinics, schools, sometimes entire villages are destroyed. Another brutal aspect of the occupation is the destruction of nature and of agriculture. Israel's colonization of Palestine's land has entailed wide-scale destruction of agriculture, including over 1 million olive trees, and that was several years ago. That is a staggering figure. For Palestinians, the olive tree is deeply embedded in their culture and their hearts, and they cherish the trees that they cultivate. These trees live for centuries, and in some families, several generations have been caring for and protecting the same trees. The loss of them is devastating and also a severe economic blow in an agricultural community. The settlements also wantonly pollute the land of neighboring Palestinian territories. Yet another aspect of the occupation that severely violates the human rights of Palestinians is the denial of freedom of movement. Due to hundreds of checkpoints and roadblocks, as well as the separation wall, Palestinians in the West Bank live as virtual captives in their communities. They are denied any possibility of a normal life, being cut off from hospitals, jobs, schools, markets, their own farmland, and members of their families. They have to spend hours a day trying to get through checkpoints to maintain their lives and to get to their jobs and to all of those other things. And often these checkpoints have been likened to animal chutes. The humiliation alone of how they're treated is appalling. Even ambulances are held up at checkpoints, and sometimes patients have to be removed and transferred to another one on the other side of the checkpoint. Untold numbers have died or suffered terrible consequences due to these delays. Hundreds of women have had to give birth at a checkpoint, sometimes at great danger to themselves and their child, and some have not survived. One of the most cruel aspects of the occupation is water deprivation. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians live without running water at home. In cities where they have it, their water may be shut off at any time for days at a time. We often have heard the phrase, water is life, and this intentional deprivation of water is a cruel hardship during long, hot summer seasons in particular. Israel has destroyed hundreds of cisterns and wells to ensure it has control over access to water in the occupied territories. Israel illegally exploits the underground aquifers in the West Bank, which is the Palestinians' water because the West Bank is Palestinian territory. But Palestinians in the West Bank are charged exorbitant rates, and water becomes a luxury they cannot afford. However, those rates are not the same for Israeli settlers who are living illegally in the West Bank next door to the Palestinians. There is no shortage of water for the settlements in the West Bank. They have water for they have water for lawns and gardens and swimming pools and whatever else they would like. And their water is never cut off. And finally, we come to the cornerstone of the occupation, what all the rest of it is in service of, which is the settlements. And they represent rampant illegal colonization of Palestinian land. Israeli settlements dominate the landscape in much of the West Bank, and some have become truly cities. There are an estimated 750,000 or more settlers in occupied Palestinian territory today, and they are all settled there illegally. And that number is growing every month and every year. This is a view from Bethlehem of one of the many settlements that surround it. Like so many Palestinian communities, Bethlehem is being strangled by settlements that are growing, expanding, and taking more of its land every year. And then we have the industrial parks. Israeli settlements aren't only for living in, they are for manufacturing and exporting to the world. These settlements produce many goods that are sold here in the US and around the world. They are making a profit on confiscated land and providing economic support for these apartheid colonies. This is one other, oh, there's one more industrial park. This is another way to give us an appreciation of what the occupation has meant for the Palestinians. It shows the loss of land across many decades, but we're going to look at the last two maps here. This is what occupied territory, the West Bank and Gaza looked like at the time the occupation began in 1967. And this is what the West Bank looks like now. These tiny little bits of land are all that is left of the West Bank for Palestinians due to this severe colonization that we just saw. So the resolution that we're talking about, opposition to Israeli settlements in Palestinian land. It calls for several important actions. A global boycott of products from the Israeli settlements. And you just saw the industrial parks. This is a powerful statement that our church has made for many years and one that we need to keep. Ending all financial support for the settlements, which goes beyond the boycott. And clearly, if we are opposed to all that the settlements are and all of the occupation, we do need to support an end to any financial support to them. And an arms embargo on the entire Middle East, which makes complete sense, especially today when we see the huge destruction that is happening there. UMC justice advocates really need this vital statement to continue our work for freedom and equality for the people of Israel and Palestine, to continue to advocate the way we have been able to in our church, and to be a witness to the world of what our church stands for. This prophetic statement and call for justice by the United Methodist Church has defined our position on the Israeli occupation for decades, and it should be renewed in 2024. Can someone tell me how I'm doing on time?
I think you have about 2 more minutes.
Excellent. Okay. The next resolution we're looking at is United Nations resolutions on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the most consistent and universal demand among advocates for justice in Israel-Palestine is that Israel simply comply with international law and respect the rights of Palestinians. We know that so many aspects of Israel's treatment of Palestinians violate international law and have done so since Israel was founded. And we've never seen that more vividly than in recent months with the terrifying and genocidal assault on Palestinians in Gaza. and which is happening as we speak at this moment. Our social principles state that we endorse the United Nations and its related bodies and the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. So this resolution that we're talking about reflects that position that we have in our social principles. It states that the United Methodist Church also supports UN resolutions, especially important ones from the Security Council, that call for protecting the rights of all people in Palestine and Israel. This resolution also calls on the U.S. and all permanent members of the UN Security Council to refrain from vetoing such resolutions and to abide by key resolutions from the Security Council, as well as rulings from the International Court of Justice. Again, those positions are never more needed than today. Supporting these UN resolutions should be a minimum standard for justice in our denomination. So we certainly would want to see this longstanding resolution renewed. Finally, we have a resolution that we will ask all delegates to oppose: church funding of church-rejected agendas. This resolution presents a damaging description of an admirable justice organization. It is also pointless. Why is it pointless? It calls for our church agencies to withdraw their membership from U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, or USCPR, and to stop giving any membership dues. But USCPR no longer has any member organizations. So there is nothing for the church agencies to withdraw from and no dues to stop paying. So obviously there's no practical reason to adopt this resolution. However, it is worth mentioning that this resolution presents a characterization of USCPR that is disturbing, calling the organization harsh and divisive and saying it lacks moral consistency. That certainly does not reflect the understanding of United Methodist Church leaders. After General Conference 2016, GBGM and GBCS formed a task force on Israel-Palestine. The task force recommended continued engagement with USCPR, recognizing their commitment to equal rights for all, international law, nonviolence, and rights of refugees. So that offensive description of USCPR should not become the policy of our church, and calling for actions that are not needed would not make any sense. So Lisa, that's everything I have to present right now. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Teresa, for explaining so well the need to renew these existing resolutions. Now, there are several new pieces of legislation submitted by annual conferences under UMKR's guidance that we hope delegates will also support. Our most critical new resolution is titled Exclude Government Debt of Countries Involved in Prolonged Military Occupations. Now, that's a mouthful, but by government debt, we mean government bonds. Investors buy government bonds as a way of supporting the country's debt. And we don't believe that United Methodists should buy government bonds in countries responsible for violating international law and human rights standards by occupying another people's land. For example, our research shows that Turkey occupies northern Cyprus, Morocco occupies Western Sahara, and Israel occupies Palestine, each one for over 50 years. So to explain more about government bonds and why United Methodists should not own them, we invited Dov Baum, an Israeli who now lives in California. Dov is the Director of Corporate Accountability for the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, and is an expert on companies involved in human rights violations. Dov developed AFSC's Investigate software program that you can use to see if your investments include companies involved in occupations or in prisons, in surveillance, or military borders. Dov is the co-founder of Who Profits from the Occupation and of the Coalition of Women for Peace in Palestine. Peace in Israel. Thank you, Dov, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. I'm just putting in the chat also the links to both these resources. The Investigate database of corporations complicit in the Israeli occupation and in surveillance and mass incarceration here in the US, and the Who Profits database that comes from Israel of companies complicit in the Israeli occupation. This has been my life's work for the last almost 20 years. I got into it by chance, and I think that thanks to Lisa's request that I'll tell you today about Israel bonds and about the bonds of other sovereign countries that are collecting debt, I got to learn a lot about bonds today that I want to share with you. So first and foremost, the resolution is focused on prolonged military occupations. And I think that's significant because there is a special place in international law for prolonged occupations. Unfortunately, military occupation by international law is legal. Unfortunately, because I'm a pacifist myself, I don't agree with that. But the idea of international treaties against war that formed the structure of the UN and our collective aspiration for the growth of the human spirit is that we do not want to have war. And so one way to prevent war is to forbid wars for occupation. Forbid the idea that countries can go off into other countries, take off their land, take their resources and make it their own. That is forbidden by international law. War itself is not forbidden, unfortunately. So there is such a thing as a legal war, which means there is something like a temporary occupation. A country can take over some other country's land and resources and manage it for a little while, but they have to maintain it. They have to protect the local population. They have to not exploit the local resources for its own economic benefit. They have to negotiate some kind of negotiated diplomatic solution in a reasonable time to allow for the internationally recognized principle of self-determination. The people living on the land have the right for self-determination. Controlling them through a prolonged military occupation is one of the worst forms of tyranny and dictatorship that you can imagine. Yes, you're controlled by a military, not just a military, but a foreign military that does not at all care about your life or any rights. There are no civil rights, of course, under a military occupation. That is why a prolonged military occupation is illegal by international law. And that includes, as Lisa mentioned, Northern Cyprus, the Western Sahara, and the Palestine occupied territories. And in fact, not many others places around the world have had such a long military occupation. There are some more occupations from the 90s. That's a lot later than the 60s or 70s, mainly by Russia, of course, and also Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia. That's it. So this is illegal by international law. The United Methodist Church pension fund called WestPath already has a policy about not investing in the sovereign debt of countries involved in such situations. It says that a church may exclude sovereign debt in any country demonstrating prolonged and systemic pattern of human rights abuses. So this is exactly the case. Any country that is involved in a prolonged military occupation is by definition involved in that thing, prolonged and systematic pattern of human rights abuses. Why is that? First of all, the occupation itself is a human rights violation. It stands against human rights law, international law. Secondly, you are holding people under a situation of no full rights. They do not have their basic rights. So what we saw in Teresa's presentation is just a fact of military occupations. You have a regime that actually acts for the benefit of some people, moves population in and inside and out of the occupied territory, settling its own people on the lands and properties of the indigenous people. And of course, this will prompt, and will always does, prompt resistance from the people who are held under occupation, and that resistance is usually crushed with violence. So that is just the situation of prolonged military occupations. They are a list and a pattern of human rights abuses. To say a word about bonds, what are bonds? We don't need to be experts, investment experts, to understand what this is all about. Let me share my screen for a moment just to show you the website of an organization called Israel Bonds. This is the organization that puts out Israel bonds to be sold in the US specifically. And it is an arm of the Israeli Treasury. It is not a private company. And it is used to, get to get money for the Israeli Treasury. That's all. That's what they do. And I'll just share my screen for very, very quickly. Let's see if it works. And I'll show you this screen from earlier today. That's what you get when you get on the website. So it's very, very clear. The call to invest in Israel bonds is a call for a political support for the state of Israel and its action at this time. And in fact, we see from the financial press, and there are many, many stories around that, and I was just reading them this morning, is that Israel is on a bond spree. Israel is looking to raise about $58 billion at this moment because of the costs of the war. So this is a way for a country to finance its budget, whatever it needs. In this case, Israel needs funding for its war. And because it is at war, it also means that the credit rating for the country, and therefore for its bonds, for how easy it is for it to raise funds, the credit rating has been downgraded by Moody's, which is one of the leading credit rating companies, one of the three leading credit. All of them see that as a negative outlook. And that is because countries at war usually are not a good investment. It's just a fact of things, because it's very expensive to be at war. It's very volatile. It's not a good investment. So in general, countries that are operating a prolonged military occupation are also not a good investment, because it is volatile, because they will have a very high military expense, because they will have resistance and therefore frequent military skirmishes and wars. So in general, any investment in sovereign bonds for any of these countries is, first of all, not a good investment. Mostly, if you want to invest in similar investments, US Treasury bonds are safer and cheaper. So why not do that? And thirdly, they are specifically designed to support that country, because this money goes directly into that country's budget for its needs. And therefore, they are highly politicized. So you don't have to support Palestinian rights in order to oppose investment in Israel bonds. I would say that investment in Israel bonds is a political statement of support of Israel. And so withdrawing from such bonds is very clearly remaining neutral. It's a very minimal request at this time. I was told that there was another proposed resolution for this coming General Conference that is related to that in some odd way, which is asking actually the same pension board, WESPATH, the United Methodist Church pension board, to reinvest in Israeli banks after, back in 2015, it decided to stop investing in them. And I wanted to say a word about that, because banking and investment and bonds, it sounds like it's all part of the same story. And also because I've been researching Israeli banks and their complicity in the Israeli occupation for, I don't know how many years, about 20 years now. This has been my work back in Israel with others as part of the Israeli peace movement. And it's striking to note that Israeli banks are, the main 5 Israeli banks are not just Israeli banks, like, you know, all banks. They give loans, they finance, you know, just like we said with the bonds, they provide financing to big state projects. It's not just that. The Israeli banks are explicitly involved in the settlement project.
About 3 minutes left, Dov.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I've asked you to interrupt, so thank you. So Teresa told us earlier about the standing commitment of the church to oppose Israeli illegal settlements and to oppose all financial support for Israeli illegal settlements, because they are at the root of the problem, and they are at the root of why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been unsolvable, because this expansion of Israeli settlements. Let me share my screen for one last time and show you our own resource, Investigate, because this is something you can keep using as you need, as you see fit. This is just one page on the Investigate database that looks at one of those banks, the Fahot, but it's true for all 5, and you can find them all there. Investigate.info is the URL. What we found about these Israeli banks is that they do a lot more than just provide loans to settlements or to the Israeli government or to Israeli occupation projects. And you can read more about it here for each one of them with a lot of the details around them. What we found is that because occupation is not a good investment, and because settlements are not a good investment, you know, they are volatile, they're in a conflict zone, there is resistance, and which is mind-blowing, because they build housing projects on land that is stolen from its original owners. So the land is very cheap. There's nothing cheaper than stolen, yes? They take it for free and then they sell it for money. You would think that's good business, but it's not. Because of that, the Israeli banks are required by law in Israel to step in when these investments actually fail and take over. In other words, if somebody buys an apartment in a settlement in one of these new housing projects, but the company building this new housing project defaults and, you know, goes out of business, the bank is required to step in as a contractor constructing the new settlement and actually finishing those housing units and selling them to the buyers.
Thanks, about 30 seconds.
Thank you. Which makes these banks directly complicit in one of the worst violations by international law, which is of actually building these settlements on the stolen land, not just providing financing for them. And that is why we recommended these banks for divestment, because we see any investment in these banks as a direct support and a direct support of building settlements on stolen land in the occupied territories. So I urge you to actually celebrate Westpath's decision from 2015 and support it, and not support the new resolution against it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dov, for helping us to understand why our church should not be involved in an occupying government's bonds and why we should not go back to investing in those Israeli banks. Remember, if you have any questions for Dov, put them in the chat. I wanted to lift up a companion piece of legislation to this resolution about the bonds. It is named Amend Paragraph 717, Sustainable and Socially Responsible Investments. So this would be an actual change to the Book of Resolution or the Book of Discipline, which would make it official. And so we ask you to support that petition as well. So there's a companion piece that is a resolution, and one that is a petition that would change the Book of Discipline and make it church law. Another new resolution that we're supporting is called Protecting the Right to Peacefully Address Injustice. In other words, protecting our right to boycott. You might be surprised to learn that around 38 states here in the US have laws that penalize and punish those who support boycotts of Palestinian rights. boycotts of Israel or of companies that are helping Israel's occupation in the West Bank. In those states, individuals and businesses can be prohibited from having a job or contract with their state. This is a serious violation of our rights that we must challenge. And with us to share why we have to protect our right to boycott is Mick Jordal, one of the protagonists in the 2021 film called Boycott from Just Vision. Mick is an attorney from Arizona with expertise in striking down unconstitutional state laws, including Arizona's law. Mick's father was a Lutheran theologian, and he spent time with his parents in the West Bank back in the late 1970s. And he returned in 2017 with his son. We're very thankful to have Mick today in particular, since he's recovering from eye surgery last week. So welcome, Mick.
Hey, everybody, and thanks, Lisa. Really appreciate being able to be here with you today. And I just want to say how inspired I am with people like Dove and her activism over the last 20 years, and for many of you attending here today. Yes, my Middle East activism stems from two extended trips that Lisa mentioned, both when I was in college and then more recently in about 2017 when I returned there with my son. What was painfully obvious to me there and then was that Israel was practicing a system of apartheid against Palestinians on the West Bank. It's been confirmed by all credible human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Israel's own top human rights group. I didn't want any part of supporting apartheid and began to knowingly boycott any products or companies that are involved in supporting the illegal Israeli settlements on the West Bank that are such a roadblock to peace. Well, let's talk about boycotts. They are time-honored. They're nonviolent ways to create change. They're recognized by our U.S. Supreme Court as at the top rung of the ladder of First Amendment protections. In fact, our national mythology is based on the Boston Tea Party. Think about it. When American patriots refused to buy British tea, and it's been used in the civil rights movement and the movement against apartheid in South Africa, which I also participated in as a young man. Starting around 2015, Israel lobby groups and Christian evangelical institutions, along with the American Legislative Exchange Council, you might have heard that word, it's also known as ALEC, started pushing model laws through state governments. And they were designed to defeat boycotts of Israel and its settlements on the West Bank. Those laws, as Lisa just mentioned, are in effect now in some 38 or so states. And it basically stands for the proposition that companies that do business with a state or any city or county of the state have to sign a written certification that they aren't boycotting what they call Israel. And so how do they define Israel? Well, in a perversion of geography and nationality, Israel is defined by all of these laws as, quote, including areas controlled by Israel. So that huge linguistic land grab means it applies to the entire West Bank and now to the entire area of Gaza. It's also long been the law that contracts or public employment offered by government authorities can't be conditioned on preferred political positions. Think about the example. Government can't say that, okay, you can apply for a contract, but it's only limited to, say, Democrats or, say, Republicans. You know, it seems to be a no-brainer. You can't condition employment or contracts based on political ideology or beliefs. In 2017, this is after my last trip to the West Bank in Israel, as a one-person law practice that I run, I had a governmental contract with my county to advise inmates in the local jail regarding their civil rights. Under Arizona's new anti-boycott law, I was faced with having to give up my right to boycott those illegal Israeli settlement products if I wanted to get paid under my county contract. Now, I've never had an inmate even bring up Middle East politics, let alone be offended that I've supported a boycott of these settlements. You know, what does it have to do with the work that I'm providing? Obviously, nothing. As Americans, you know, we're free to boycott whatever we want, even our own government, except there's a glaring exception when it comes to Israel. So I refused to sign. I didn't get paid for some 10 months. but I continued providing the services to the inmates. With the help of the ACLU and many others, including the Center for Constitutional Rights, we sued the state of Arizona to overturn the law. 4 other similarly situated people in other states also filed challenging identical laws. With one exception, we all won great court rulings enjoining the enforcement of these laws based on the likely violation of our First Amendment right to boycott. Well, you'd think that the Arizona legislature would then say, oops, we made a mistake. But no. In my case, and in all other cases of successful injunctions, and following an ALEC-driven playbook, the states simply changed their laws. They made them apply only to government contracts of over $100,000 and only to companies with 10 or more employees. Well, my contract was under that dollar amount, and I didn't have 10 employees. So those changes essentially mooted out all of our successful cases and dissolved our injunctions, as they no longer applied to any of us. In a bizarre outlying Arkansas case, bucking Supreme Court precedents, the lower federal court there ruled that economic boycotts are no longer protected by the Constitution. Basically, economic boycotts are not speech. That case was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the court ultimately declined to get involved. Hence, the issue is still in limbo, with one circuit bucking the trend and most of the others with only a no longer pending cases, but federal court opinions saying that the statutes are likely unconstitutional. The battle is still continuing here. But since then, it's been super clear that these anti-boycott laws involving Israel were only the tip of the spear to destroy our constitutional right to engage in peaceful boycotts. In the last 2 years, legislation has been introduced in some 30 states and adopted in many that tie government contracts to certifications not to boycott many other areas, such as, well, if you want the contract, you have to certify you won't boycott fossil fuel companies, or you won't boycott the firearms industry. They've also included giving up the right to boycott companies that fail to provide reproductive health care or gender-affirming care or diversity and equity requirements. Pretty soon, the companies affected by these revised laws will have to sign a laundry list of right-wing causes that they will not boycott in exchange for a contract. Think about it. If these statutes are ultimately upheld, there's no limit to what the government can do to tie government work to preferred political positions. And I really don't think it's hyperbole to wonder, could these laws extend to government employees and not just independent contractors? Could they apply to the receipt of government benefits, like attending a state university? Could they become a requirement for receiving public benefits? I applaud your church's proposed resolution asking the church to oppose any interference by local, regional, or national governments in your right to address injustice through nonviolent economic means. Churches have historically been involved in various boycotts throughout history, and the church needs to advocate to regain this threatened right. If you want to learn more about this issue, you can go to a website. It's run by another law firm, and they're called Palestine Legal. Just Google Palestine Legal. They track all of these state laws. You can also, as Lisa mentioned, you can view the recent documentary called Boycott. It's available on Prime Video, and it tracks my cases as well as the cases in Arkansas and Texas. So thank you very much, and best wishes to you all. I'll hang around for the question and answer session. Great.
Thanks, Mick. What an activist. That's just amazing that you've challenged these laws. So thank you for showing us the urgent need to defend our rights, including our right to boycott. So now we turn to a subject close to our hearts, children. UMKR submitted 2 resolutions about child arrests and incarceration of children. One is for children anywhere in the world who are incarcerated, and the other is about Israeli detention of children. They both ask that 3 of our general church agencies work together to formulate a plan to educate United Methodists on the treatment of incarcerated children. To help us understand why such a plan is needed, we asked Miranda Cleland to share her knowledge and experience. Miranda is Advocacy Officer at Defense for Children International, Palestine. It is the only Palestinian human rights organization working exclusively for children's rights in Palestine. Miranda lives in Washington, D.C., where she studied international affairs and Arabic language at American University. So welcome, Miranda.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks for having me today. Hi, everyone. I am an advocacy officer at Defense for Children International Palestine, which, as Lisa mentioned, is the only local civil society organization focused exclusively on the rights of Palestinian children. I live in Washington, D.C., but the rest of the DCI Palestine team is based out of Ramallah with field offices in Nablus, Hebron, and we have a presence in Gaza. DCIP documents and exposes Israeli violations of Palestinian children's rights in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, so the entire occupied Palestinian territory, in order to advocate for accountability at the national and international levels. We also provide legal aid to children who have been detained by the Israeli military, which I'll talk a little bit more about today. And then we document their experiences of ill treatment and torture at the hands of Israeli forces in order to create a record of their experience and be able to track trends over time, to be able to speak to sort of the general experience of children who have been arrested by the Israeli military. Every year, Israeli forces detain, interrogate, torture, and imprison between 500 and 700 Palestinian children. We're talking about almost all boys between the ages of 12 and 17 in the occupied West Bank. The Israeli forces routinely harass children younger than the age of 12. And now, as Israeli forces carry out genocide in Gaza, we know that Israeli forces are detaining and torturing Palestinians, including children in Gaza, but unfortunately, most of that is happening in North Gaza, where almost no human rights organizations have any access or ability to document those experiences. So I just wanted to say that as something that we currently don't have any data on, but acknowledges is most likely happening. So in the occupied West Bank, these 500 to 700 children who were detained by Israeli forces every year, about 60% of them, 3 and 5, are detained from their homes by Israeli soldiers in the middle of the night. This looks like Israeli soldiers showing up to a family's home at 2 or 3 in the morning, bursting through the door, waking up the whole family. The child is usually dragged out of his bedroom. Everybody was asleep, obviously, it's the middle of the night. And at that moment, about 75% of children experience some form of physical violence at the hands of Israeli soldiers. They are kicked, slapped, punched, they are struck with a soldier's gun or helmet, or otherwise beaten. Then soldiers will force the child into the back of an Israeli military vehicle and take them away. Remember, at this point, the child's parents have no idea where he is being taken, why, or when they'll see them again. The child will then spend anywhere from 10 minutes to many hours in transit, typically blindfolded, with his hands behind his back. When the child arrives at an Israeli interrogation center, which are often located within Israel or in a legal Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank, an adult Israeli interrogator will question him for hours with the goal of coercing a confession. Interrogations are designed to be incredibly coercive, and children regularly report being beaten, insulted, forced into stress positions, and worse. Israeli interrogators place 1 in 4 children into solitary confinement for the purpose of eliciting a confession. On average, we found that once a child is placed into solitary confinement, on average, they'll spend about 15 or 16 days there. So that's more than 2 weeks in a very small room Children describe the room as having rough walls. The lights are on all the time. It's very dirty and smelly. I don't have to tell you that this is incredibly psychologically harmful. Many children who spend time in solitary confinement report anxiety and depression. We've documented cases where children self-harm while they're in solitary confinement or afterwards, and even try to commit suicide while they're in solitary confinement. All of this has happened before we get to a trial or a hearing in the military courts. If a child proceeds to a trial, he'll be tried in an Israeli military court where the judge and prosecutor are Israeli soldiers. It's all conducted in Hebrew, which is a language most Palestinian children don't understand. The conviction rate, if you do go to trial, is higher than 95%, with the most common charge, which is throwing stones, carrying a maximum sentence of up to 20 years. Most children, and many adults too, will take a plea deal, as that is the surest way to get out of the system as quickly as possible. This is not a system that's interested in justice or upholding the rights of the accused. It's purely designed to exert total control over the Palestinian population. So getting out of the system as soon as possible is really important, especially for children. The Israeli military detention system and Israel's targeting of Palestinian children interrupts childhood in pretty much every way. Whether a child is detained for a few days, months, or even years, the experience leaves, a lasting impact. Many children drop out of school once they've been released, and many struggle to reintegrate with their friends, families, and communities as they deal with things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, fear. While the child doesn't always say this himself, we do often hear from the parents that this is not the same child as before. Military detention is just one example of how Israeli forces seek to exert total control over Palestinian children and their families. We've seen the last few months that the Israeli government and its military have no qualms about detaining, torturing, and even killing Palestinian children and their families with complete impunity. And I'm sure you know that the United States plays an outsized role in all of this by empowering Israel's impunity. The United States funds the Israeli military to the tune of $3.8 billion every year as the largest recipient of U.S. foreign assistance since World War II. And as Israel right now is carrying out genocide in Gaza, Biden has fast-tracked more weapons and more military funding by passing Congress to send more money and more weapons to the Israeli military that we know that they're using to kill Palestinian children and their families. This is a totally unacceptable use of our U.S. tax dollars, especially as we live in a country where people struggle to access affordable healthcare, housing, and food. I'll close by briefly just saying a few words in support of the resolution regarding the more general incarceration of children around the world, including the United States. Under international law, a child should only be held in custodial detention as a method of last resort, and they should never be subjected to physical or emotional harm or deprived of any of their rights, like the right to remain silent, the right to a lawyer, the right to have their interrogation recorded. That is true in occupied Palestine. It is true in the United States, where somewhere around 60,000 children are incarcerated in this country. We know that imprisoning children does not contribute to a just society, and that the system of mass incarceration, whether in Palestine or the US, does not have children's best interests in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Miranda. That was excellent. It is heartbreaking to see really how these children are being abused and imprisoned, and they certainly need our prayers and also our voices raised in their defense. So now we're going to turn to another important resolution in justice advocacy. This one is called Holy Land Tours. Like the first two resolutions we heard about today from Teresa, this resolution also has existed for many years. It's been submitted by the General Board of Global Ministries, and it's a vital tool for encouraging learning and genuine peacemaking among United Methodists. Speaking to us about this resolution is Reverend Jane Easley. She's our United Methodist missionary, serving as the advocacy coordinator at the Methodist Liaison Office in Jerusalem. She and her colleague from the British Methodist Church help Methodists visiting the Holy Land to engage in responsible tourism, as described in the guidelines of this resolution. So Jane is clergy and from the Northern Illinois Annual Conference, where she served several congregations. In the 1990s, she served for 3 years as a United Methodist mission intern, first assigned in Jerusalem and then with MFSA. Jane has a unique connection to this resolution and can tell you more about that. So welcome, Jane.
Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk with you about yet another very important resolution. It's a privilege to be with this group of people working for justice in Israel and Palestine. The resolution I want to recommend to you today is Holy Land Tours. This resolution was first passed in 1992, actually back when I was a mission intern, which is the precursor or the predecessor of the current Global Mission Fellow program of our global ministries, a young adult missionary service program. Back in 1992, I was working with Reverend Dr. George McLean as an intern with Methodist Federation for Social Action, which back then was housed in Staten Island. And George and I co-wrote the original resolution. So it's exciting that it has remained in our book of resolutions all this time, but it is due to expire. And so we want to seek its resubmission for the coming 8 years. One of the things that I used to see when I worked as a mission intern was tour groups coming through the old city, going from church to church, not making any connections with Palestinian Christians, often not making any connections with advanced projects that we help to support. And they would say, oh yeah, we're so busy. We're seeing this church and this church and this church. And I would say, well, what about connections to our United Methodist missionaries? Oh, there just isn't time. Well, you and I know that there's time for anything if you plan it. And so the Holy Land Tours resolution is a resource to invite tour planners and tour organizers to plan their trip to include time with current issues, not only to see the buildings built over particular historic holy sites, but also to meet with the people of the land, to meet with Palestinian Christians and Muslims, to meet with Israeli Jews and Israeli Christians, to meet with the people of land and find out their circumstances and their witness to faith in this time. It is so striking to me how many people, particularly in the United States and Europe, have no idea that there are Palestinian Christians who continue to provide an unbroken strand of faithfulness since the time of the original disciples, from the time of Peter and James. And it's really hurtful to them that so many Christian tour groups will come to the area and not engage with the Christians of the area today. In addition, you know, our United Methodist Church has the Advance, a series of different projects which have a relationship with our denomination and are able to raise funds for specific projects with some oversight from our Methodist Liaison Office. With these Holy Land Tours, we can arrange ahead of time to visit United Methodist affiliated projects. So we can take you to a refugee camp. We can help you make a connection with a settlement if you want to visit a settlement. We can take you to an advanced project and see the UMKR Conflict Resolution Center or the Hope Secondary School in the West Bank village of Beit Jala. And so we are providing an opportunity for contextualization of our faith, not assuming that Jesus just lived back then, but seeing how the people of Jesus continue to provide witness in this day. So this, I want to lift up this tour as educational, letting people know that there are Christians in the area and opportunities for contemporary worship. It's an invitation to prepare wisely, not to get surprised once you're on the ground and think, oh, God, I guess maybe we should have met with some Christians while we were there. It's an opportunity to meet with the people of the land and as I said, to tour projects that are affiliated. This resolution is also an important tool. Many people plan Holy Land tours in ignorance of what the alternatives are. And so it's great to have a copy of the Holy Land Tours resolution. Perhaps your bishop takes newly ordained people. Perhaps the district superintendent is organizing a trip to then take this Holy Land Tours resolution, say, I just want to check in, is your Holy Land tour going to be in compliance with this resolution? In some cases, the people organizing the tours really have no idea that the Methodist Liaison Office exists in Jerusalem, that these resources are available to give them a more meaningful experience of faith and of the current time. We know from our Gospels that Jesus lived under military occupation. In his day, Roman military occupation. It is a profound privilege to meet with the living stones, the Christians of these days who can share their own experience of living under military occupation, in this case, Israeli occupation, and how their faith has grown and through it all. Please do all you can to support the Holy Land Tours resolution, and I will remain on afterward if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great, Jean. Thanks so much for explaining the importance of this resolution. Thank you for your service with the Methodist Liaison Office in Jerusalem. And we do hope that all of us who are United Methodists here today will be in touch with your office when we're planning a trip to the Holy Land. So we're coming to our final presentation. Thank you for your patience. This is the subject of resolutions that we'd ask delegates to reject. So besides those we already heard about, there are two others, and Teresa Basile is back to tell us about those now. Thanks, Teresa.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Lisa. I'm going to screen share again very briefly and then come back to you. I wanted you to see the titles of the 4 resolutions at this time that we are asking delegates not to support, to oppose. And we've heard about a couple of them already. Church funding of church rejected agendas. That was the one that needlessly asks our church agencies to withdraw from USCPR. And then we had rejection of the anti-Israel blacklist, which is very poorly named. And Dov talked to us about that. What an excellent thing it was when our church put 5 Israeli banks on a no-buy list. And that is a decision that should not be reversed. And then we come to 2 resolutions you haven't heard about yet. Both of them are about anti-Semitism. And this is the first one I'll be discussing. Confronting 21st Century Anti-Semitism. I just want you to see the titles now, and we'll come back to them later. The other one is Petition on the Acceptance of a Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. Okay, so this is a difficult subject, and it's a difficult ask to ask our delegates to oppose resolutions that purport to oppose racism. Because certainly in our church, that is something we want to do. And we have made a commitment to that for many, many years. Although we are still growing into that commitment and learning that we have much more to do. When this subject comes up, feelings run very strong. And it's important to understand why we would say these are resolutions to oppose. The first thing we need to know is that our church has made clear our opposition to racism in our social principles. And we also have more than one resolution that specifically names and rejects anti-Semitism. One of those is number 3292, United Methodists Guiding Principles for Christian-Jewish Relations. This resolution expresses our pain over the long history of anti-Semitism in Christian history, and it states it is our responsibility as Christians to oppose anti-Semitism whenever and wherever it occurs. And there's a great deal more of value in that resolution. It's well worth reading. Our church also has adopted a resolution honoring Holocaust Memorial Day. And you can find these resolutions at the website umcjustice.org, which is the website of our General Board of Church and Society. In our social principles, which do not expire the way a resolution would expire, we have an excellent definition and description of racism, which we oppose in all its manifestations. As we know, there are many forms of racism throughout the world. So we do not name every form of racism that exists in the social principles. If we privilege some with our attention and neglect the suffering of others, that can do more harm than good. We believe that a special definition of only one type of racism is not needed in our church, especially when it includes the dangerous and harmful elements of these two resolutions that we're considering. So the first one that we're looking at, confronting 21st century anti-Semitism. This was submitted by an individual named John Lamperis, who some of us might be familiar with. For many years, he's been dedicated to tearing down advocacy for Palestinian rights and many other forms of peace and justice ministries in our church. And it should be noted also that this person who submitted it, John Lamperis, is no longer a member of the United Methodist Church. He has joined a new denomination, the Global Methodist Church. So we don't know for sure if this resolution will be struck down because the submitter is no longer in our church. That is a decision for this and a number of other resolutions that hasn't been made officially yet. But in case that is not what happens, we should be prepared and aware of the problems in this resolution, be prepared to speak to it and oppose it. There is more going on here than simply a statement to oppose a form of racism. This resolution has a good deal of language that sounds innocent and good, but it has some troubling passages that should make it unacceptable for our church. The resolution uses a disreputable and offensive Israeli website as a key source, and it strongly endorses this website. It doesn't just cite it as a source. It endorses this website, which is filled with propaganda and malicious misinformation. Embracing that endorsement alone would be a disturbing action for our church. The resolution professes to protect the right to criticize Israel, but then it turns around with this statement. It would also be morally irresponsible and intellectually dishonest to ignore anti-Semitism when it is expressed in criticism of the world's only Jewish state. No suggestion that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism belongs in any United Methodist resolution. Accusing activists of anti-Semitism has become a much used and dangerous tool to condemn and silence advocates for Palestinian human rights. At the same time, it decreases our society's understanding of true anti-Semitism, which we do need to be alert for and to oppose wherever it appears. Our church should not support dangerous misuse of these charges of anti-Semitism, and we shouldn't be encouraging misunderstanding of such an important subject. It might be possible to remove some of the most damaging passages in this resolution and preserve something that is acceptable and useful. But if that does not happen at the conference, we would strongly recommend rejecting this resolution. And the other one that I want to tell you about is petition on the acceptance of a working definition of anti-Semitism. Now, this resolution would have our church adopt what is known as the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as our own policy. IHRA stands for International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That name in itself carries a lot of weight and adds gravitas to this definition that bears its name. Understandably, a number of institutions and government bodies, after heavy lobbying, have adopted the IHRA as their policy, usually with well-meaning intentions. What we need to know to carefully consider this choice for our church. The core statement in this definition is pretty simple and straightforward, but the entire IHRA definition includes examples of what anti-Semitism looks like in practice, and that is the problem. It includes in those examples criticism of Israel, specific views and statements about Israel that many human rights activists would consider legitimate or to have some merit. We don't have time today, unfortunately, to examine that wording and discuss the details of it. And I think it would be most instructive to know how strong the opposition to this resolution is throughout the human rights community worldwide. Just this month, the ACLU wrote the U.S. Department of Education, urging them not to adopt the IHRA definition because it is a dangerous tool that could come to silence free speech on U.S. campuses. Last year, more than 100 Israeli and international organizations wrote to the Secretary General of the UN, asking the United Nations to reject this definition of anti-Semitism because it is being misused to protect Israel from legitimate criticism. Those groups wrote to the Secretary General saying he should resist that pressure from Israel to adopt the definition. What's interesting, besides the content of the letter, are the signers. They include Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Presbyterian Church USA, Pax Christi USA, Jewish Voice for Peace, and dozens of other Jewish organizations around the world. B'Tselem, which is Israel's own leading human rights organization, and in that long list of signers, the global ministries of the United Methodist Church. In practice, the IHRA definition has often been used to wrongly label criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And that, I'm sorry, now I was quoting from one of the statements that's been made about it. Pro-Israel groups have used the examples attached to the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism to silence dissent about Israel's attacks. But that is actually quite an understatement. This definition is being used as a weapon against activism in ways that do great personal and professional harm. Even the primary author of this definition, Kenneth Stern, has stated clearly and repeatedly in recent years that it is being used harmfully and that he is strongly opposed to it being adopted by governments and institutions. It was not created for that purpose, but for bodies like that alliance to do internal work on the subject of anti-Semitism.
So do you have more for us, Teresa?
I do. Sorry, I lost my place. With all that we know today about the highly politicized misuse of this definition, it would be a terrible witness for the world to see that our church has adopted this resolution. We have many statements and tools on hand to do the good work of opposing and dismantling racism in our church and our society. And we should give our wholehearted support for genuine anti-racism efforts. So I am going to put into the chat an excellent collection of resources and statements about this definition that were compiled by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. And I'm going to then again share my screen with you. And there we are. Okay. So you've heard about these two. And in summary, these are the 4 resolutions that we are asking delegates to oppose and asking others who are here to talk to your delegates about. Church funding of church-rejected agendas, rejection of the anti-Israel blacklist, confronting 21st century anti-Semitism, and the petition on the acceptance of a working definition of anti-Semitism. And I won't read all of these, but this is the list of all of the resolutions you've heard about that we are asking delegates to support. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Teresa. And now we have a few minutes for some questions and answers. And let me get to one of the questions that did come in was about that list of who opposes the IHRA. So please take note that it's in the chat. And I believe that Teresa's planning to have perhaps a page on our website with some of this information so that you can access it easily, because it's very, very important. So there's a question for Dove here to briefly explain once again how one can purchase a government's debt. And is it the same as purchasing a bond? Is that the only equivalent, a debt and a bond?
Yes, it is exactly the same thing. Usually you can purchase bonds in the stock exchange or through any financial organization that sells investments. Specifically, I think Israel bonds are unusual in that regard that they are not traded in a secondary market. In other words, you buy them and then you have to hold them through their maturation. If it is a 10-year bond, you have to hold it for 10 years. That's it. So that actually makes them not a great investment for institutions. But yes, a bond and a debt is the same thing. When you buy a bond also of a corporation, this is what you buy. You are loaning money to the company. And then this IOU paper can be actually bought and sold and can change its value in the market, unlike an Israel bond. So the money you pay goes directly into the Israeli treasury. It is used for whatever they need it for. That's just giving a loan to the Israeli government. That's it.
Thank you. I didn't realize that it was had a time on it, that you had to purchase it for a certain length of time.
Like any loan always have a maturation date. You get an interest for a certain amount of time. So you can buy it for 1 year or 5 years or 10 years or even 30 years. But that is specified in the original bond agreement.
So in other words, Westpac or anyone who has Israeli bonds would probably have to continue to hold them until their maturation.
They really cannot cash them out. It is impossible. Specifically with Israel bonds, it is impossible. They have to hold them until maturation. I don't know if they hold any Israel bonds, but really what we're asking everyone to do is to just commit to not buying anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yes, not buy anymore. That's good. And a lot of states did purchase, a lot of, like my state, Pennsylvania, purchased a whole lot, millions and millions of dollars in Israel bonds.
Yeah, we saw that in the news in the last few months. A whole lot of states, I don't have the numbers here, but billions and billions of dollars in debt to Israel, offered by US states. Mostly Republican states were the ones that led in the numbers. And they did it as a political action. I can provide you with a list of statements from the different state treasurers and leaders that say, we want to support the Israeli war effort, therefore we are buying these bonds, which I think just makes the case that these bonds are actually a political statement and not an investment.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Thank you. Now, there's another question about boycotts, and we have a legislation about, something completely different, the anti-boycott laws. But there are also, and we don't have legislation specifically about the boycotts of Israeli products or things that are harming the settlements, companies that are harming the settlements, except that in our one basic resolution, it does talk about, we approve that all nations should boycott Israeli products and companies harming in the occupation. So someone's asking a question about these products that are produced in Israel and sold here in the United States. Should we have a boycott against them, and how would we implement that? So I didn't know if, Teresa wanted to address that. We have participated in boycott efforts over the past years.
Yes, we have. And we tend to support the boycotts, especially that the BNC has called for.
The BNC is
the Palestinian BDS National Committee. And they are the initiators of the call to the world to engage in a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement around the world. And they put out that call in 2005. And it has been growing exponentially ever since. And we are part of that movement. So because we see this as a Palestinian struggle, we like to take our lead from what Palestinians are calling to us for. And when they initiate a boycott, we sit up and take notice, and those are the ones we especially want to try to support. There are others sometimes that start here in the US and elsewhere. We don't tend to start our own personal boycotts, but we want to join those that many partners are doing to build a massive support in society that we can do with partners. So there are a few on our website under boycott and under campaigns also, action campaigns. And we have some more to put there this year because there are new ones coming up now.
I want to add a word, if I may, Lisa.
Sure, Deb.
I want to say that people kind of expect to get a list of what shouldn't I buy. I get this request for many years now. People want a boycott list, but there is no boycott list. And it is important to note, you list it under the UMKR, in the UMKR website under campaigns, because it is campaigns. Mm-hmm. So the call is not to boycott all this or to boycott all that. The call is for us to try and be strategic and get some companies to withdraw their support of the Israeli occupation or withdraw their own complicity in human rights violations by targeting them one by one. So at all times, there is a boycott or one or two that are alive. And they're not even always just boycotts. They might be corporate accountability campaigns, asking these corporations to become better global citizens. Not always asking us to boycott them. So the boycott here is just like a shorthand name for a movement that uses more tools than just boycott.
And I'd like to add that if you are going to boycott something, you have to tell somebody, because it doesn't do any good to boycott on your own. But if you can tell others, especially if you can tell the company itself by writing a letter to its CEO that you are choosing to boycott their item, we have to make the impression on the company that what they're doing is wrong. And directly telling them that is one of the best ways that we have found.
And it's a United Methodist policy that we do inform them of that, and that if they change the specific things they're doing, and we tell them what those changes would have to be, if they make those changes in what they're doing, then that would trigger an end of the boycott.
Right.
So we disclose all of this ahead of time, and then we engage in a boycott. I am putting a link in the chat for a page at the BDS movement website. Get involved, what to boycott. So these are the things that at this time they have campaigns directed at.
So thanks for your interest on that topic. Most of the other questions are sort of process questions. Someone has asked for the exact resolution numbers of the 4 that we suggest that they reject. And some are asking to get this, more information from us in an email so that they can share it with their delegations. And so I'd like to say that I believe we'll follow this up with just exactly that. Someone even suggested like a sheet, all in one sheet, a helpful list. As Teresa showed on the PowerPoint, the list of the names of the resolutions, what we oppose, what we reject, or what we approve adopting, and what we would reject. So that delegates in the midst of craziness of voting, which happens very fast at General Conference, can quickly refer to a little paper that would give them, our recommendations.
And we're going to be creating that. We first did the work on creating a little bit more in-depth resources, and you'll see some of them at links that have already been put in the chat early on. Resources for all of our resolutions and a couple of documents that compile them all into a few pages. But we know delegates also need something much simpler, like Lisa just said, like a one-pager just listing what our recommendations are for and against. And we will definitely have that for you. And it'll be on our website. And we can also do a mailing of that to everyone on our mailing list. And if you've registered for this, then you are on our mailing list now.
Right, and we would hope too that if your delegation has not heard a presentation from us, please ask the delegation head to invite us, because we have a prepared one that is shorter than this, just specifically about the legislation. So we'd be happy to appear by Zoom at your delegation meeting. So I think we've reached the end of our time for Q&A. And let me turn this back to Bridget then for some additional announcements. Thank you all so much for being with us.
Hey everyone, thank you all again for joining us. This webinar was recorded, and so that will be shared kind of in the coming days. It'll both be on UMKR and MFSA's websites, on our YouTube channels. We always send them out as well. So be on the lookout for that, and that's also something that you can share with people that you know that are delegates or your delegations. We're also planning to work together to do a plumb line as well. And so that'll be another thing that'll be written that'll help with that. We won't be doing another webinar until after General Conference, UMKR MFSA webinar. We're going to be focusing on General Conference, but we will be picking that back up after General Conference. So you'll just be on the lookout for more information about when that happens. We will be, there is a webinar that's been shared in the chat, and I just want to reference this. There's a General Conference kind of briefing webinar that's being put on by the CalPAC MFSA, and it is on February the 24th. There is you can either go in person, there's information about that where it will be, or you can attend online. There's a small registration fee. I'm gonna put that in the chat. Hopefully you can see it. Whoever's been doing that in the chat earlier can make it look better than that. But UMKR will also be presenting at this webinar, and there'll also be representatives from Fossil Free UMC, climate justice groups, presentations on regionalization, presentations from some of our racial ethnic caucus groups. So that'll be a great conversation for folks who want to hear more about more legislation that's going to General Conference. Again, thanks everyone, and please be in prayer for our church and for all of us that are going to be at General Conference working for justice in our denomination and in our world. And I hope you join us the next time we are in conversation together.